I chose a very short reading from Luke's Gospel as well today, and I just want to give you a little bit of background to it. When you're translating from any language into a second language, and particularly with biblical studies, there are three main methods of doing it. The first one is called literal translation, where you translate a noun with a noun, a verb with a verb, etc. But actually, this is a very poor way of translating because you use a lot if you try to translate literally. So the second way is called paraphrasing. And this is where, particularly with the Bible, where you've got a theological agenda, and then you translate a Bible passage, say from in the New Testament from Greek into English, or from Hebrew in the Old Testament into English. But you have a theological agenda, and you force the translation to conform to your ideas. That's called paraphrasing, and obviously that's not very good. So the way the scholars use is called dynamic transference, where the scholar tries to steep herself in the culture of the time, the history of the time, the theology of the time, the politics of the time, and then tries to get into the mind of the original author and represent that in the translation. Obviously, there's still an element of subjectivity there, but it's the best way of doing it. So today, I just took a single phrase from Luke's Gospel in chapter 15. In Luke chapter 15, Luke tells about three parables of Jesus where stuff is lost. There's the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost child, the prodigal son. So at the end of one, and the first one, the lost sheep, he uses this one liner which is really beautiful. But I've taken two translations of it because in the two translations, they're identical apart from a single word. And the word is going to be the clue to some of what I'm going to say to you in the homily. So listen. So here's what the New International Version says of this one phrase. I tell you that in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous people who do not need to repent. The very same passage, according to the Good News translation, says this, and there's only one word difference. In the same way, I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 respectable people who do not need to repent. Words inspired by God. So you've already been introduced to these three extraordinary pastors from Tucson, Arizona. And their church has a beautiful name for the church. It's called the Temple of Universality, an extraordinary title. And we've been in correspondence, Darrell and Martha and myself, over the last few months, email correspondence. And I've heard some of Martha's homilies, I've heard some of Darrell's homilies, and I've heard an extraordinary interview he did. And I can tell you without a shadow of doubt that this is one of the most articulate, passionate, and encyclopedic knowledge people I've ever come across, Darrell. Extraordinary wisdom and an ability and a passion to put it out there. And I've described Martha as a kind of the female archetype of the prophet, the prophetess, who does prophecy in a really gentle way. She challenges in a really, really lovely, gentle fashion. So in one of our conversations, she picked up on an idea that I had put out there years and years ago called Homo originalis, that there's only one human being on the planet. And she issued me a very gentle challenge. She said, we're going to be out and visiting Palo Alto, and we'd like to come to the church. How would you feel about developing this notion a little bit further? And so this homily today is dedicated to Martha Seán. Yeah. So I'm going to take that theme, and I'm going to work it a little bit more today. So I'm going to make 4 main points this morning. The first one, I'm going to talk about the lost sheep. Then secondly, I'm going to talk about God's role. Thirdly, the human role. And then fourthly, the conundrum of time. So they're the 4 pieces I'll address this morning. So the first one, this story of the lost sheep that we find in Luke's Gospel. And you all know the backstory to it. It's very simple. Christ is telling a story where this shepherd has 100 sheep. And one of them gets lost and wanders off. And the shepherd leaves the 99 in the desert and goes off to find the sheep. And when he finds it, he's really, really, really happy. You know, and because this little sheep has wandered away, he puts it on his shoulders and he carries it back rejoicing. And then he makes this statement, there is more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than 99 who do not need repentance. So I want to try to unpack that statement of Jesus in a few different ways to start off. So I imagine that his original intention as he's dealing with these poor people, and they're not poor because of economic conditions, they're poor because they're lost. There is no shepherd there. They're subject to all kinds of control by a religious or a kind of oligarchy. So they're lost because there's no self-empowerment. So it's not the poverty of financial situations, it's the poverty of a lack of self-empowerment or control over their own destinies. They're the poor people. So Christ says there's more joy than when those is empowered. So here's what Christ's intention was, I believe, that he was saying that God, in her compassion, is constantly going out to look at those people who are in straits, who are finding life difficult. And God puts them, if God is male, he's going to put them on his shoulder and carry it back. If God is a female, she's going to carry it in her arms next to her heart. But whatever way, they're brought back. They're not threatened back, they're not driven back, they're not dragged back, they're carried back. So that was maybe Christ's original intention. You look then at what the Christian churches have done with this message, particularly in the Middle Ages and coming up to the 1500s. And so the best case scenario was that the stray is the sinner who's left the fold of the one true church. And the pontiffs and the pastors go after them with a vengeance, and they threaten them, and they drag them kicking and screaming back into the fold where they're now safe in the Orthodox community. So that's the most gentle approach. Later on, it becomes worse and worse. Now, the pastors are no longer interested in saving the lost sheep. They're interested in roasting the lost sheep. So there's going to be inquisitions and trials and tortures and burning at the stake. And then to make matters worse, for all eternity, that soul is going to be burned alive in hell. So that's how the lost sheep was treated in medieval Christian time. Now, I want to offer two totally different interpretations of that. And here's my first one. When I think of this story, I don't see the stray as the sinner. I see the stray as the seeker. That the stray is the individual person who has the courage to leave the kind of the comfort of orthodoxy and venture into mysticism and Gnosticism. The one who's prepared to trade, their security for the freedom of the search. That's the one. That's the person that puts a smile on God's face. And when God goes out to encounter it and put it on his shoulders, it's not to bring it back to the safety of the flock so it can be penned in and lectured at again. It's so that this one might inspire the others who are still stuck with tags on their ears and numbers on their wool to go out and begin to seek for themselves. And for me, the great archetype of this kind of an individual is Mary of Magdala. Her feast day is actually next Sunday, 22nd of July. So for me, Mary personifies that person who's prepared to leave the safety of the system in order to find truth for herself. And so when I compare Mary of Magdala with the Pharisee in every religious system, not just within Judaism, but within every religious system, what do you find? Here's the dichotomy you find. On Mary's side and the Pharisee side, you have love as distinct from law. You have passion as distinct from safety. You have fire in the belly as distinct from mediocrity in the mind. You have freedom of the spirit as distinct from the following of dogma. So when I look at this extraordinary character, for me, Mary and Jesus in some senses are the archetypes of the female and the male versions of mysticism, or the transcendence on earth of God. So in some senses, what the Jesus who gave us Christ consciousness is complemented by the Magdalene who gave us, I would call it, Christa consciousness or Magdalene consciousness. So in some senses, they represent the transcendence and the immanence of God, the complementarity of God in his essence or her essence. So that would be my first unpacking of this statement of Jesus Christ, that the stray is not the sinner, the stray is the seeker who goes out to look. My second kind of hit on that interpretation would be this, that the stray is the soul with the courage to incarnate. There are many souls who are constantly in God's presence, and it's very secure, very, very safe, very, very beautiful. You've got nirvana and bliss of all kinds. It takes a lot of courage for any soul to leave that kind of security and venture out into incarnation. And these are the ones that put smiles on the face of God. So the stray, again, is not the sinner who's wandered away. The stray is the soul with the courage to undertake incarnation. Because in some senses, that is how God experiences. There is, in some senses, the transcendence of God is the isness, God's total being, then the kind of God's self-knowledge represented by the Word of God, and then the love that God has for whom she knows herself to be, represented by the Spirit, the Holy Spirit. But this God is incapable of experiencing because there is nothing which is other to herself. And so she spins off all of these souls in order to generate experiences. But the interesting thing is, it's not that souls are God's representative to have experiences to bring back and tell God about them. Every single soul is God incarnate. So you are the way in which God is experiencing. Every soul with the courage to incarnate is the way in which the divine experiences. So we're like a beehive with thousands of members. If all the bees refused to leave the hive and stayed at home, there'd be no honey, there'd be no nectar, and much more importantly, there would be no stories to offer each other or experiences to share with each other. So we have to think of ourselves as a hive of bees, not just as individuals. We're not representatives of God, having experiences that we then take back so God can say, wow, amazing, wow, I wish I were there. It's not about that. We're operating as a monad, just like you've got 70 trillion cells in your body. But every one of them acts as a monad. When you're sitting down on your couch and you feel like having a sandwich, and you get up and you go across to the fridge and you open the door, every part of you has to go. You don't leave your tuchus on the sofa, you carry your tuchus with you. Every part of you operates as a monad. That's the same with God. God operates as a monad. You are the way in which God is having experiences. So that is the greatness, the human aspect of God. There's a great British proverb that says, "He knows not England, who only England knows." In other words, if you're English and you've lived all your life in England, you've never been outside it, you really don't know England because you've got nothing with which to compare it. Only after you travel do you understand what England is. And it's the same for the souls. It's only as souls have the courage to travel outside of the safety of nirvana, only then can they understand what nirvana is about. So that would be my second hit on that parable. That there is more joy in heaven over one soul who repents. It's not about sinners coming back home. It's about souls coming back with the stories to tell and the experiences to share. And God carries that one on his shoulders in the sense that, in fact, it's God who's having these experiences. We're not just delegates or representatives. It is God who's having those experiences. That'll be my first point. My second point then, so what is God's role in all of this? I want you to imagine that you've bought a two-way ticket, a train ticket, from where you are right now, and the first leg of the journey takes you back to where God is, and the second leg of the journey takes you from where God is to where you are right now. What would that journey look like? So there'd be an outward leg, and there'd be a return leg. The outward leg would look something like this. You start with your experience of yourself as a human being, a discrete, ontologically separate human being, one of 7.5 billion of us on the planet right now. And you realize, as I said before, and as Martha asked me to elaborate on, that in actual fact, we're just articulations of a single human being. There is only one of us, and I call it Homo originalis. So you look, for instance, when a man and a woman make love, and the first cell is created as zygote. It splits in 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, etc. And eventually you wind up with 70 trillion cells. But every single one of them in some senses is identical. You could take any cell from the human body and you could recreate the entirety of yourself, sequence the DNA. Even though they've specialized in some ways, some of them have become heart cells, some of them have become part of your kidneys, some part of your saliva, some part of your eyes. But ultimately, every one of them is capable of doing anything it wants. So ultimately, there's only one of us here. There's only one human being. If you could extract the essence of any one of us, you could recreate the entire human experiment. And I don't mean our biochemical DNA now, I mean our spirit DNA. If you take the essence of what it means to be any one human being, you've understood every one of us, you could recreate the whole human experiment. But that's only a stage in a bifurcation process that happens again and again and again. So at some stage, a bifurcation between maybe hominids of some kind resulted in Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens sapiens. But way before that, there was an earlier bifurcation point, and I call that place Animal Originalis. So there was an original cluster of cells, multicellular organisms. Some of them became fish, some of them became reptiles, some of them became amphibians, some became birds, some became mammals. So there was a bifurcation point earlier on, and I'm going to call it Animal Originalis. In fact, way before that, there was another bifurcation point, and I'm going to call it Protozoa Originalis. That at one stage, there was a single-cell protozoa, somehow on planet Earth, from whatever source, and that this bifurcated into all the life forms, plants and animals, flora and fauna that we find on the planet. Where did that come from? You go back further, and there's some kind of a putative Big Bang that brought everything into being. It didn't just bring matter into being, it brought space into being, it brought time into being, it brought, the laws of physics into being. And where did that come from? And that goes ultimately back, at the beginning. And I would call that Deus Originalis, the original source, of which the Big Bang was an articulation that led to bifurcation points at various stages. So that's the outward bound journey. What happens as we begin to reverse that process? So in that process, you quickly come to the realization that life as you experience it is a dream that your ego is having. And your ego is a dream that your soul is having. And your soul is a dream that spirit is having. And spirit is a dream that source is having. So now you begin the return trip from source. And in this sense then, source is the original zygote. And like the original, any zygote, it bifurcates into two parts. And the two parts we call the transcendence of God and the immanence of God. And every subsequent experience of duality is simply another articulation of this evolutionary trajectory. Everywhere you find duality, this is the recapitulation of what Source originally did in splitting itself into the transcendence, the ineffable mystery of God on the one hand, and the immanence, God as she reveals herself through nature on the other hand. So that's the journey that comes from that place. Now, science has a lovely statement that says, sometimes in an emergent phenomenon, the sum is greater than the sum is greater than the addition of the parts, or the total is greater than the sum of the parts. So, for instance, you could never have predicted in the early universe that two elements which coexisted for billions of years but had never gotten together, oxygen, and hydrogen, when they finally got together and they dated and they mated and they made love, they produced an emergent phenomenon that we never would have guessed at. We call it water. So looking at the two pieces, you never would have guessed. So science would say then that in some senses, the total is greater than the sum of the parts. Now I would make the claim that source is greater than the total of the sums. That God is a way more than we can give her credit for. In the same way that, in the sense that Shakespeare is much greater than his collected works. So this leads to an idea in theology which is called the difference between pantheism and panentheism. Pantheism is the belief system that God is the sum total of all that exists. You look at all the phenomenology, everything that can be experienced in any way, either through your sensorium or through intuition, and God is the sum total of all that. I would say it's much greater. Panentheism is the belief system that God is not just the sum total of all that can be experienced, but a lot more besides. So there's a lot more to Shakespeare than his collected works. So in some senses, that's the journey as we come back down here, which leads me to my next point. So number 3 then, what is our role, or what is the human role in this trajectory? So I'm sure you're aware of the notion of fractals. A fractal is simply any pattern that repeats at an infinite number of scales. And you get fractals all over. The fractals are found everywhere. The original title comes from an extraordinary genius called Mandelbrot in mathematics, where you can reproduce beautiful versions of an original pattern. Visually, it's really stunning when you look at it mathematically. But we find that in time, we live in fractals of time, both natural fractals and human-made fractals. So, for instance, what are the natural fractals of time? The same pattern that keeps repeating at various scales. So you start off, for instance, with the notion of a day. And a day is what happens when the planet just orbits on its own axis. So after a while then, you have a month where the moon is orbiting our planet. So that would be another scale up of it. Then you have the notion of the year. So it takes us a full year for this Earth to circumnavigate the sun. You build that up, and it takes somewhere around 265 million years for our solar system to circumnavigate the Milky Way galaxy. And presumably the Milky Way galaxy is circumnavigating the entire cosmos of which we are aware. So there would be a time fractal. And then there are human time fractals, like we've invented the notion of seconds and minutes and hours and weeks. They don't exist naturally. We invent these, but they're fractals of each other. We find the same kinds of fractals in various taxonomies. So, for instance, if you look at the human body and you go back again to mathematics, there's a brilliant mathematician called Fibonacci who created a series which is 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 35, etc. And you get every subsequent term by simply adding the two previous ones. So 1 and 1 is going to give you 2. 1 and 2 is 3. 2 and 3 is 5. 3 and 5 is 8. And so what you find is, when you even look anatomically at the human body, it's built in that fashion. All over nature, you find that the Fibonacci series, this extraordinary scaling. So we find these fractals again and again and again. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that every single one of us is a fractal of source. And not just a fractal, we are holographic fractals. In other words, we contain everything that the original has in miniature. So if it is true then that we are fractals of God, then it must mean that we're capable of doing precisely what God does. Because in some senses, God is playing all the parts, as I said. We're not just representatives of God, we are God experiencing. So every single one of us is a fractal of that reality. So it must mean that every single one of us as well is capable of playing all the parts. And now for kind of to stretch you into a bit of heresy. What if, there's a great theory in physics, when they were trying to unpack quantum mechanical theory, which led to extraordinary anomalous data, like the idea that somehow the witnessing consciousness is responsible for what the system is going to deliver, whether it's going to operate as a wave or as a particle. And so the original interpretation was called the Copenhagen interpretation, where they agreed upon how you could resolve these apparent difficulties. There was a different interpretation came in the 1950s with an American physicist called Hugh Everett III, who invented the notion of the many worlds or parallel universes. Yeah? And what is it telling us? So here's my hit on it, that there are sufficient universes to go around to accommodate every single possible configuration of choices that every single human being could make. So here's the scenario I want to present to you. You think at the moment of anybody in history or is alive at the moment, somebody you're aware of, somebody you admire, or somebody you detest. And I guarantee you there's a universe in which you're playing that part. There's a universe in which you're dropped into that person's spacesuit. Everything else is the same. So you can take this person at any stage of their growth, embryonically, as a teenager, as an adult, whenever you want to. And you're dropped into their spacesuit, which means you're operating from their body, their physical body, with their emotions and their mindset. The only thing that's different is it is your soul that's getting dropped in. So when you get dropped into that, you're constrained by the physicality of it, by the emotions attached to it, and by the mindset attached to it, but you have a soul which is different, which has had a different trajectory. How are you going to play that part? Everything else in the environment is going to be identical. And therefore, but you are the catalyst that's going to precipitate some kind of change. As soon as you begin to think from your soul, and speak from your soul, and act from your soul, all of the other players in the drama are going to have to change because they're getting different cues from you. And you're going to be subject to influences from them. How well would you play any of these roles? So that becomes the great what if. There are certainly enough universes in order for that to happen. You can be dropped in. There's a universe in which you're being dropped into every single human being that exists right now, that could exist, and that did exist right now. How well would you play those parts? So how many different roles are you going to play? We think sometimes that if we could choose to be somebody else, we'd all want to be Cleopatra or Napoleon or whatever. But the truth is that that's not just what's open to you. You get the opportunity of being a fisherman off the west coast of Ireland, a grandmother in the bush in Africa, a taxi driver in New York City. And as you play those roles, what's going to happen? You're going to become less judgmental because you're operating from the inside out, and you're going to become more compassionate. It's not just about signing up to be somebody important. It's signing up to be everybody, because there's only one of us. And there's a flip side to that. And as part of that process, how do we prepare for that, or how do we practice that? We do it in our dream life. Every single night as you dream, you are the producer of your dream, the director of it. You created the costumes, the locations, you created the plot, you created the dialogue, and you play every single one of the characters, even though for purposes of enjoyment, you pretend like you're only the dream ego. In actual fact, you're playing all of those parts. So in actual fact, we're doing it on a nightly basis. And is this a preparation for the multiverses, or is it evidence that we're already under the influence of some kind of nightly cross-fertilization of two or more parallel universes? Whatever it is, what you find is that if you're a dreamer like I am, that there are some dreams in which you're not very proud of yourself. Even as the dream ego, you did things that you're not happy about. And certainly some of the characters in the dream, they're really, evil characters. Welcome aboard. They're all you. They're all me. So we're getting prepared for the parallel universes. So what happens, for instance, when you learn how to dream lucidly, which is the ability to realize while you're dreaming that you are dreaming. And now you've got a choice. You can now make the choice to act morally and compassionately in every single one of the characters that you're creating in your dream. And this is your practice for doing the same thing in the parallel universes. Sure, you're already doing it. And when you get to a place finally where you're able to, even in your dream state, live and speak and act with love and with compassion in all of the characters, then you're ready to be an avatar. At that stage, there will be a parallel universe in which Hitler is a loving being played by you. Then you know that you've arrived. And so that's what it looks like as we begin to play the other parts. There's a flip side to that. It means that everybody else gets a chance to play you. So there is a universe in which Jesus Christ, and the soul who played the part of Jesus, the carpenter from Nazareth 2,000 years ago, is playing you right now. There's a universe out there in which Jesus is playing you. Wouldn't you like to know how he's playing it? And if you did find out how he is playing you, would it help you to play you a little bit differently? Would you tweak your performance a little bit? No, the truth is, you get a chance to play all of these. Jesus Christ, in my opinion, did not save the world by being nailed to a cross. Jesus Christ saved the world by playing all of the parts of all of the characters and doing it with love. He took every single role, every single person, whoever was or could be, and he inhabited that spacesuit, and he played it out of total love in every circumstance. And you're being called upon to do exactly the same. You are being called upon. You will save the world by playing all of the roles of all of the people and doing it in a loving fashion. That is how you will save the world. So how much time do you need? That's my fourth point. You don't need any time. Because there is no time. Time is a construct of human consciousness. Because we're forced in incarnation to operate with this little piece of wetware, this little laptop computer we carry between our ears, which is so small that it can't grok the entire gestalt. So we have to break it up into bite-sized pieces and process them sequentially, thus giving rise to the illusion of time and change. But time does not exist. And there's empirical evidence for that. One of my favorite studies is to look at the near-death experiencers, what it is like for somebody who's been physically dead, but still is experiencing. And one of the things they talk about particularly is the life review, where in the blink of an eye, you get to experience your entire lifetime, every significant event in your lifetime. But more importantly, you don't just get to experience it from your own point of view, you get to experience it from the point of view of everybody involved in every single encounter you had. You are them, because there is only one of you. And you do that, all of that, in the blink of an eye. So it doesn't take any time. It takes timelessness. It takes the ability to be outside of time, to create an altered state of consciousness for yourself where time actually doesn't exist anymore. So in conclusion, ultimately most of us think that this is the only life we have. You look around you and think, yeah, I am me, fill in the blank there, name or whatever, and you think that's it. And the question then becomes, okay, how well are you playing you? Do you need to tweak that some? I mean, if you want to develop Christ consciousness, are you going to manage it in this lifetime? Are you going to need another lifetime to complete it? Which is exactly the question that John the Baptist asked of Jesus before John died. There's a great story where John is in prison. He's awaiting execution. He knows he's only got a few more days left. And he keeps hearing about this extraordinary character, this Jesus from Nazareth. So he sends out his disciples to ask Jesus one question. Are you the person we've been waiting for? Or do we need to hold out for somebody else? And typically Jesus, he answers not by a yea or a nay. He says, go back and tell John what you witness. The blind see. The dead are raised to life. Cripples are healed. And the poor have the good news preached to them. When they go back and tell this to John. Now, the question then becomes for every single one of us, is that what my life and your life look like right now? What does it mean for you to be able to open the eyes of the blind? What does it look like for you to be able to raise the dead? What does it look like for you to be able to heal the crippled? What does it look like for you to be a bearer of really good news? Can you do it now? Or are you going to have to spin off another parallel universe and come back and try better the next time? Namaste, guys. So it's the third Sunday, so we're opening it up to discussion. Margaret, you just grab the mic.
In your example of the sheep, the one sheep, and you said that in one example that there was joy because this one had the courage to, or was seeking. Did I hear reincarnation?
Okay.
Well, I thought everybody reincarnated.
Okay, great, fabulous. Okay. Let me answer that. So I gave 2 hits on it, Margaret. The first hit was that the stray is not the sinner. The stray is the seeker, the one who has the courage to leave orthodoxy, and search for mysticism. And the second one I had was that, this stray is the soul that incarnates. Now, I believe that all souls are encouraged to incarnate, but I'm sure there are souls who prefer to cling to the safety of the presence of God. And so we're totally free. None of our heavenly mentors is going to force us to do what we don't want to do. They were trying to stretch us. And at some stage, as we hear the stories of those who've come back from reincarnation, even the kind of most reluctant of us are going to say, you know what, I think I'll give it a shot myself. So eventually, I think all souls do wind up incarnating again and again and again, but some of them are more reluctant to do it than others. And it is the example of people who've come back and reported precisely what the experiences have been and what the growth has been like. That they're the ones who encourage the rest of us to take the chance and to jump into incarnation. Yeah. Margaret, another Margaret.
I guess I got a little mixed up.
Okay.
When you were talking about parallel universes and having these experiences in another universe, in maybe another person, but because just the soul goes there. Is that happening simultaneously?
Yes.
And is that like an reincarnation?
That's a great question, Margaret. So is it happening simultaneously? My answer is it is, because there is no time. So it's not a sequence of you do a life in the 13th century, and then you come back in the 17th century, and then you come back in the 20th century. In God's dispensation, there is no such thing as time. There are different facets of the crystal. It's like, if I were to use another example, imagine you buy, let's say, War and Peace, the great big novel by Dostoevsky, thousands of pages. It's going to take you weeks and weeks and weeks to read through all of that stuff. You're going to read it line by line, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, page by page, chapter by chapter, and you go through the whole thing. But the truth is, before you crack open the book, Everything you're going to read is already there. And in fact, if you went to the shop and bought that, it's going to take you 3 or 4 weeks to read it. If you buy that on Amazon, you can literally download the whole book in 18 seconds. And if our computers were faster, we could download it instantaneously, which means that the processing speed is a function of our intelligence, our minds, our brains, our human brains, rather they're not built into the essence of the thing itself. So everything is happening simultaneously. It's all present now. But we have to kind of examine it one feature at a time. Yeah. And because of our little human brains. So reincarnation, is in some sense, it gives the impression that there's a sequence involved with it, which is unfortunate, because I don't believe there is a sequence involved with it. I believe it's all happening at the same time. It's just, how big a mindset have you? Can you multitask? As a woman, you know this. You have to learn to multitask, because there's so many things to be done simultaneously. And at some stages, since the soul itself is infinite, it's literally God in drag. So since the soul is infinite, it's able to grok all facets of the diamond instantaneously. It's able to just gobble up the book in one fell swoop, and all the books in one fell swoop. So it's not an iterative process where you're going from one life to the next lifetime and you're kind of, bringing your learnings with you. There's an instant cross-fertilization happening. And that's evidenced, in my opinion, by our dream life. So one of the functions dreams performs, I think it performs many, many functions, but one of them is it actually allows a confluence or a cross-fertilization of several parallel universes in your dream state. And so while Margaret Parra is sleeping in bed, there are other versions of the soul, which I know as Margaret Parra, experiencing something else, and you are experiencing that in your own dream life. So they're happening simultaneously, and there's only the now, the eternal now. Yeah. Sure.
Can you talk about the gifts that Mary Magdalene brought to her spiritual community and therefore to us, or her? Yeah.
Okay.
Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. So, unfortunately, history is written by the winners. So I've said to you many times that there are 7 different timelines that we experience. There's the factual history, factual past, which really, really happened, and that's influenced who we are. There's the fictitious past that we're taught in our history books, and that influences who we are. There's the factual present, what's happening in our world right now, which is influencing us. And there's the fictitious present, which is the fake news, which is influencing how we're experiencing right now. And then there are 3 versions of the future, and one that I don't believe in. There's the notion of a fated, inevitable outcome. So when you talk about how do you predict the future, you can't predict the future. There is no future. There's only 2 possibilities. There's the possible future, and there's the probable future. The probable future is what's going to happen if we don't change our ways, and the possible future is what happens if we do change our ways. But so you can't predict it, because human beings have free will. Now, history is written by the winners. And so you have what really happened in the early community, which Mary of Magdala represented for me the feminine face of God and Christa consciousness. And then you find out what was the fictitious past, where Mary is written out of the Gospels, are written in as a repentant whore. That's who she becomes. By the 5th century with Gregory the Great, she becomes the repentant whore. The conflating of 3 different biblical stories into one person. And so now Mary, who is the archetype of the feminine face of God, becomes the repentant whore. And she's only a woman, so she can't be a priest. I mean, even the mother of God, Mary, the other Mary, can't be a priest because she's got the wrong gender. And so you have to write Mary and our community out. Mary was the leader of a very powerful church, a very early church. And there's even a gospel attributed to her, which was found in a grave in Egypt in 1895, the Gospel of Mary. But then you had, as soon as, the reason I put the word in respectable in one of the translations here, there's more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than 99 righteous people. And the other translation said, respectable people. Respectability is a curse. When you aim for respectability, you close down creativity. And so the early church at some stage began to realize, who's going to take us seriously if we have women in charge of our churches? In a time of ultimate patriarchy, if we want to gain any traction whatsoever, we've got to get rid of any references to women leadership in the church. And so Mary is suppressed. So who was she? For me, she was the soulmate of Jesus of Nazareth. And they came in as twin souls. And their function was to be the imminent incarnation of the transcendence of the female and male aspects of the divine. That was their function. And so in some senses, as Christ mediated masculinity through his oratory and through his courage and his fierce determination, Mary exemplified the feminine face of God through her courage, but through her love and her compassion and her gentleness and her commitment to being at his side, even as he died on the cross. So they represent the two parts of what the immanence of God looks like on planet Earth. But she's been suppressed as the feminine face of God has been suppressed, as femininity in general has been suppressed. And now are we coming through that phase where we begin to realize it's not a question of oscillating between God as male and God as female. It's a question of integration. It's the yin and the yang, because they inform each other. There's a complementarity of parts here. That we must aim not at the anger of overthrowing the patriarchy in order to initiate the matriarchy, because that leads just to hatriarchy. We don't go from patriarchy to matriarchy. We combine the two. We bring the male and the female together, because every one of us has both aspects at a soul level and even at a physiological level. Yeah. Georgie.
As I've always thought what you've said, and I believe, we are all part of one deity. Okay? Then you just said that our experiences is God learning, right? Does that mean that we are becoming more aware, because we're all the same, flowers, and that we are becoming more aware of our deity? That's God learning.
That's a great question, George. So the difficulty of incarnation, part of the difficulties of incarnation is that as you get parachuted into a particular vehicle, or spacesuit, I call them spacesuits. I think every one of us, every soul will at some stage want to be a rock, experience life as a rock, as a daffodil, as a banana slug, as a hominid, as an avatar, as an extraterrestrial, as an angel. Every soul is want to encounter all of these different spacesuits in order to learn how to love unconditionally in all circumstances. Now, the spacesuit is going to determine the level of self-awareness that we bring to the exercise. So the self-awareness of a rock different from the self-awareness of, let's say, a tiger. Very different. And the self-awareness of a tiger is very, very different from somebody sitting in front of the television that's just been inundated with garbage. And the self-awareness of that person with the kind of remote in front of the television is very, very different from a guru in Himalayas who's meditating constantly on isness. Very, very different. And it's very different from the mindset or the self-awareness of a Christ-conscious individual like a Jesus of Nazareth or a Mary of Magdala. So the spacesuit is going to limit the ability at self-awareness. But that is not good or bad. It's just that God is generating experiences at all these different levels. But the whole object of the exercise is to get to a place where some species arises that's aware of that process. I told you many times about a great vision I had years and years and years ago, where I saw all of these souls stand in front of Source and volunteer for incarnation. And one soul, whom I'm going to call Gaia, said, I want you to send me to the third rock from the sun in that particular solar system, and my job will be to breed life forms until I throw up a species capable of recognizing its own divinity, and therefore the divinity of all other life forms. And that Gaia animated this little rock of ours, planet Earth. And she's thrown up all these life forms, starting with just protozoa, and then multicellular organisms, and then at some stage dinosaurs, and then mammals, and then hominids, and then Homo sapiens, then Homo sapiens sapiens, and then Christ-conscious individuals. So we're at another bifurcation point. I've talked about many times. It's the bifurcation point of Homo sapiens sapiens, either into Homo spiritualis, where we realize that we are God, or Homo sociopathicus, where we continue to operate out of greed and a sense of individual, ontological, discrete separateness from God, from nature, and from each other. Yeah. Ingrid.
One of the most powerful spiritual practices I know of is Ho'oponopono. And I'm watching some videos right now with Dr. Hugh Len, who brought it to the United States, and Joe Vitale, who wrote the book No Limits. And so I'm watching this guy who was Dr. Hugh Len is a psychiatrist. He was assigned to the Hawaii criminally insane hospital, and it was had a terrible reputation as a hellhole. And he went there, and he had a whole different approach. He just looked at each patient's records. He never saw the patients. He saw their picture, their history, their crimes. In Ho'oponopono, you take 100% responsibility for what's showing up in your life. And he just did the practice of, I'm sorry, please forgive me, I love you, and I thank you. This place is in disarray, high turnover, psychotic reactions. He did it every day. And all of a sudden, there was a shift. The patients were calming down. There's better turnover. Some of the plumbing started to work again. Some things grew again. And it was just through this 100% responsibility, and you clear yourself of memory. He calls it memory. That place is now shut down. He's taken this protocol to the world. Yesterday I was at a workshop, and one person was really bugging me. She had a lot of my own qualities. She liked to talk a lot. She liked to be center of attention. She was putting all her ideas out there, and she was bugging the hell out of me. And so, oh my God, I got to start practicing some Ho'oponopono. And after that, when the class finished, I was actually able to go up to her and hug her, and I said, hey. But I really, all my buttons got pushed, but I actually started to do that. And Dr. Hugh Len says, if you can just go into the world, transmit, I love you, and thank you, we could help save the planet.
That's brilliant, Ingrid. So two kind of things come up for me. The first one is that he got it immediately, that the reason that we can do that kind of exercise is that they're us. There is no separation between us. So it's just the right hand washing the left hand. That's the first response I have. There is only one of us. And the second, I was listening to a podcast on my way down this morning on a physics program. And the guy was talking about the difference between, coherent and incoherent light. So if you take, for instance, a 60-watt bulb that you hang in your room, and it's radiating light out in all directions. And if you go more than about 15 feet away, it's not able to illuminate the stuff at the far side of the room. So, because it's diffused light all over. If you could take that same bulb, 60-watt bulb, and make it coherent light, laserize it so that you could focus it on a single beam, you can cut through steel, the same 60 watts. The only difference is it's coherent, it's focused. So that's the difference between prayer that works, or compassion that works, and stuff that doesn't work. If we have this kind of general idea, I'm going to pray for my brother Seamus in Ireland, a big deal, and I wonder who won the World Cup today, and I wonder what we're going to have at the picnic for grub. What kind of prayer is that? I call it a laserized intentionality. That prayer involves attention to the topic or the target, and intention, the focus, laserized, and that's what he's doing right there. Is a focus with the realization that there is only one of us. We have time for another question? I think Chris had his hand up first, and then Cecile.
Yeah, I'd like to say something about the ego. Most of us, I think when we were brought up, we were oftentimes asked the question, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? And to study hard in school so you can make something of yourself. So I think we're all kind of victims of that. We get the ego more and more entrenched into our being. I had a very strange experience years ago. I think I might have mentioned this here a couple of years ago. It was late at night, and I was walking down the street, and all of a sudden, there was nobody there. And there was like this thing, I don't even want to call it a body, there was just this thing that was there, and I had no interest in it at all. And it was just, I don't know if this was a mini enlightenment experience or what, but it lasted only 30 seconds or so. But there was just nothing. I mean, someone came up to me and gave me great news or bad news, it would have meant nothing. And I had no desires. I didn't want to walk on water or heal people. It was just, there was just this thing, and I was aware of this thing, the body, and that was about it. And there was just, I can't emphasize it enough that there was just nothing. And I realized after a while reflecting on this experience that all the lies uh, from the questions that I was asked when I was a kid about being somebody and so forth, I realized that what my real goal is to be nobody. And it was such a freeing experience. So maybe that's our goal, just to dissolve into nothingness with just maybe some kind of an awareness, but there just no opinions or anything. I'm still kind of struggling with what that experience was all about, but it was very, very freeing.
That's brilliant, Chris. Absolutely brilliant. So my hit on it is that what you're experiencing is the kind of the antechamber, that the experience of being nothing is the prelude to experiencing being everything. That's what God does in some senses. There's a great Buddhist phrase for that. They say, form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. So Thich Nhat Hanh put that very beautifully. If you take a flower from a field and you pluck it, a flower consists totally of non-flower elements. If you were to take away the sunshine and the rain and the wind and the minerals and the soil, there wouldn't be a flower left. So in some senses, form is emptiness. The flower consists of no-thingness. And the opposite is emptiness is form. Out of that no-thingness, out of that kind of a dark womb, of that dark fecund womb, arises everything that could possibly exist. So in some senses, there is the kind of the oscillation or the antechamber, that the experience of being nothing, no thing, is the experience of being ready to realize that you are everything, not the ego, not Chris, being everything, but that some senses there is only God, which is everything. Yeah, Cecile was next.
This is also a personal comment. I heard about Ho'oponopono quite a long time ago. The thing that I didn't realize at first, and it was very beautiful when I did, is that what Hugh Len did there was that he actually took personal responsibility for all of the actions that were committed by supposedly other people. And that was a transformative thing. Mm-hmm. And it's a lovely mantra, but I think it takes time to be willing to say, oh yeah, I did this. Mm-hmm. So, anyway, I think that's important.
That's the other side of the coin. If the truth is everybody is me, and therefore I need to be compassionate, the other side of the coin is I did it, in some senses. So whether it's in another parallel universe that I acted out this place, the realization that there is only one, there is only God, and that we are the ways in which God experiences, and that until we've been able to self-limit, the first thing God did was some kind of self-sundering, some kind of self-fragmentation, divide herself up into a myriad of souls. But they're fractal souls, they're holographic souls that contain the totality of the original in miniature. And the realization then that anybody, anywhere doing anything is me doing it. And anybody evidencing love is me evidencing love. And when a particular kind of individual, articulation of that realization operates from that place, then ultimate compassion is extraordinarily powerful. It only takes one person to transform planet Earth, if that one person is totally self-transformed. It's 11 o'clock, guys. We need to kind of go on with Mass. So before we continue with our Eucharist, let's offer each other a sign of our peace.